Okay, so I think I'm going to kick off rather than keep everybody waiting. So welcome everybody to this online event from the Foundling Museum. So combat stress from Trafalgar to today. So the starting point for our panel discussion tonight is the extraordinary life of George King, from looked after child to fighting at the Battle of Trafalgar. And it's his life is featured in our exhibition Fighting Talk, which is on until the 27th of February. And I do recommend it if you haven't been already. So George's education at the Foundling Hospital gave him the unusual skill of he was not only taught to read, but he was taught to write as well, which was really unusual for a boy of that time. And that allowed him to leave the most incredible handwritten account of his life. And that's what's given us all the ammunition for the exhibition. So George came into the Foundling Hospital in 1787, and he was fostered for a few years, started his education, and started an apprenticeship as a confectioner, from which he ran away, and he was swiftly press-ganged into the Navy. So in his 24 years in the Navy, including his time at the Battle of Trafalgar, George endured some really terrible experiences. And it was that aspect of his life which made us think about the kind of long-term impact that would have had on his mental health and how that compares to the experiences of servicemen and women today as they transition out of the forces. So without further ado, I'm going to ask our panelists for this evening to briefly introduce themselves, and then Dr. Caroline McWright is going to kick us off with our first little talk. So we're going to have very short talks from each of our panelists and then some time afterwards for questions and answers. Caroline, do you want to start?
Hi, good evening. I'm Dr. Caroline McWright, and I'm currently a postdoctoral researcher at Exeter University. And the project I'm working on at the minute is called Military Afterlives, which is where I'm coming from really with looking at George King. I am an ex-Royal Air Force officer. I was a squadron leader in the Royal Air Force for 16 years doing logistics. And my PhD looked at how women in particular transition out of the military into the civilian world. So that's me.
I'm going to go alphabetical. Can I ask Mark, will you introduce yourself next?
I guess I would say I'm an artist who works with film and photography primarily. I make a lot of photo books. I'm particularly interested in and affected by conflict and mental health issues, and I've done several projects on those themes about mental health issues amongst young people, about mental health issues amongst the military in a project called Battle Against Stigma, following a stint as a war artist in helmed Afghanistan about 10 or 11 years ago. And I'm talking to you now, funnily enough, from frontline Ukraine. So I guess you could say I've continued that interest in the impact of conflict. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. And Chris?
Well, I'm afraid I'm only zooming in from Exeter. Like Caroline, I'm a lecturer in medical history at the University of Exeter. I joined here in September. I research and teach the history of medicine, in particular psychiatry in the 19th and 20th centuries. I'm really interested in how the histories of psychiatry, empire, and migration are linked across this period, particularly in the context of the modern Middle East. My first book is going to be on the history of colonial psychiatry and mental illness in Palestine in the first half of the 20th century. And I'm now thinking more about migration and mental illness across the British Empire in kind of roughly the same time period.
Thank you very much indeed, all of you. So I'm going to hand over to Caroline to share her slides and give our first presentation.
So, as I said, my name's Caroline McWright, and I'm currently working on the Military Afterlives project at Exeter University. And we're looking there at the life stories, really, of military veterans to understand how they transition into civilian life, but also how their service impacts that transition and what comes after. And what we find is that when I read George's biography or his memoir, I found a lot of parallels between what happens now with what happened to him. And so we're going to sort of trace George's life through his memoir and compare it to what's happening to veterans today. And the veterans I'm going to be talking about and drawing on come from way back from the 1970s up to the modern day, to Iraq and Afghanistan. First of all, I'll start with the joining, because I think that's a good way to start. I mean, Kathleen's already mentioned that George was basically institutionalized before he joined the Navy, which is of course another institution. So in many ways, that transition from him out of his civilian life into his naval life probably wasn't too big a step, because he was quite used to having an ordered life in terms of having his meals cooked for him at a certain time, being told what to do, what to wear, all those kind of things. But what I really wanted to point out with George's joining story is that obviously he was press gang, which is what Kathleen's already said. But today people join the military for all numbers of reasons. And this is Adam here, who joined at a similar age to George. And he just wanted to mess around with boats. He never really thought much about going to war. And it's that excitement, actually, and that idea of adventure and travel that can actually motivate people to join in the military. And we still find that today. And I think that resonates a little bit with George, in terms of he had a friend who was in the merchant navy, and that's what encouraged him to join and get away from his chocolatiering. We also see a strong sense of duty in terms of what George went through. That famous line from Nelson at the Battle of Trafalgar, and again that still resonates today. This is a quote from Chris, who's an RAF reservist in Afghanistan, and he, back in 2018 when he was interviewed, he still was talking about his duty and felt he was serving his queen and country by being in the military. So we still see this idea of service and duty within the military environment today. And it's difficult with George's memoir, because he doesn't give us a lot of ideas and thoughts about his emotions, but we can see that he was motivated by a certain amount of professional pride in the way he talks about, and he can remember how he managed in the jobs that he did when he was on board ship. But there was also a lot of almost pirateering in what he did as well, in building up the British Empire when he was capturing boats, whether they be Russian or Dutch. So it's still a legitimate, if you like, idea of being in the military organisation. One of the things that struck me just before George started to write about the actual Battle of Trafalgar was the beauty he found in that moment just before the battle commenced. And that's often something that we find veterans talk about. They get put in situations where they're very heightened. They're very aware of their environment and what's going on around them, and the world can become very sharply in focus, if you like. And I think you can see that. I mean, this is Phil. This is one of our older veterans who's talking about the Omani Civil War when he went there to help the Sultan of Oman. And it's just, you know, the desert sunset and sunrises are quite spectacular. I know from my own time in Iraq, and it is one of those things that many people don't get to experience. But of course, combat itself is not beautiful, and we see from George's comments here that you know, we suffered greatly from their grape and canister. I think he went on to say about 30 to 40 of his shipmates were killed or injured in this particular action. And then I've just linked this to Adam talking about Basra, and just that again, that sense of danger comes through, I think, in what Adam is talking about. But with Adam, there's very much an excitement to it as well. He's quite energized, I think, by the situation he finds it in. And again, we see with our veterans, and this is missing from George's memoir because he doesn't talk about emotions at all, really. But we see in our veterans that they miss this buzz, they miss this sense of challenge and urgency and almost life and death that they have in military situations. But one of the things that definitely hasn't changed much between George's memoir and modern military life is the lifestyle in terms of the drinking culture and the camaraderie that takes place in the military. And drinking is still quite a big problem in the military, I do have to say. When I was down in the Falklands, for example, I think we had something like 60 official and unofficial bars on the island, which meant that there was a lot of drinking going on in social hours outside of work. And of course, the rum ration was actually a part of what the naval sailors were given during their time at sea. And that, you know, you still get a large element of that within the military today. Coming back to the camaraderie again, I really like this quote from George because I think this really delves into why he found it so difficult to leave his life at sea. He tried a couple of times over the course of his life to move away from the sea, but he was always drawn back to it. And I think it comes back to the camaraderie he had and the friendships he had whilst he was on board. And again, I think that is something that we see today, very much so in the military, whichever of the services you're in. You know, you get very close to the people you work with and the people you live with, and you rely on them a lot for your social well-being, if you like. When that's taken away from you, you can feel quite at loss. So as I said, George did try to leave the Navy a couple of times, and this time he left, that you can see here, he just couldn't find any work. And we see that most military people today actually are quite successful in getting a second career outside of military. There are plenty of jobs, but what we find is that they do struggle in that transition in terms of adjusting and negotiating their behaviours from within that military into that civilian environment. And you see here from Eddie, who was a Gulf War veteran, first Gulf War veteran. He actually left the military and then rejoined just before the first Gulf War. And one of the things he said he missed was that sense of excitement. And I do see in the research that we've done that veterans do talk a lot about rejoining, about coming back in, and quite a few of them have left and rejoined for exactly the reasons that Eddie's talking about here. So transition itself, when you do eventually leave, is very difficult. And I think even the most successful of us that transition out of the military environment into civilian life find it difficult in different ways. It might be professional, it might be family, it might be more socially rooted. And what I really found this little quote here from George telling, when he says, "I was like a lost sheep and obliged to live as I could." And it can feel like that because you have lost your tribe when you leave the military. And many of us do keep in close contact with people who are friends who are still serving, or we keep in contact with friends and colleagues through military associations. But it's still very difficult to suddenly find yourself in many ways alone, trying to carve your own path, if you like, in terms of how are you going to move forward into civilian life? And the word that I found in my research that describes this is this idea of liminality. It's where you're betwixt and between two states. So yourself as a military service person and yourself as a civilian, and there can be this sort of no man's land in between. And it can be quite, Aaron here, who was in Iraq, he struggled when he came back, very much at a loss, not really know where he wanted to go, what he wanted to do. And he thinks, suffering from PTSD in a very limited way, if that is possible, in that he was almost frightened, I think, to go out and make his way in the world. And I found, again, when George went to America, and we see him effectively getting a job very successfully as a schoolmaster, but and then the townspeople wanted him to stay and continue being a schoolmaster, but for George it wasn't enough. And I just, again, this quote for me stood out, because he says, I then instantly thought of the different I was placed in that to what I was for 4 and 20 years previous. So for 24 years he'd been at sea, and now he was in this different environment where he would have had to watch his P's and Q's, because he's in a room full of school children. He wouldn't have been able to behave the same way as he did. And it can be very disconnecting for people who've been institutionalized, and for George being at sea for all those years to try and step back into civilian life. And he feels he needs to return to sea, and of course he does. So he doesn't really, again, he doesn't really go into detail. He just says, I had to go and return, and kind of it suggests he's going to come back to the teaching, but of course he doesn't. He goes back to sea. And these few quotes are a little bit about what it's like for people transitioning today, that as they step back into that civilian world. I think the first one from Carl, who was a Royal Marine who fought in the Falklands and did service in Northern Ireland. And he's done a lot of stuff since he left the military, but for him, nothing seems to compare to the time he had in his military life. And I find that really sad, that he's not been able to move on. Whereas Justin, who is a more recent veteran, if you like, who served in Afghanistan, he's managed to reintegrate, is how he calls it, to become a civilian again, if you like, and still to make sense of the difference he feels between military and civilian. And I've kind of kept gender out of this, but Samantha here is my final quote, and I think she kind of, I wasn't sure of the audience, so I kind of blanked out the swearing, but she's struggled to get on with other women, civilian women, when she's left. She's found that the way that they are very different to the way she is when she was in the Navy. And I kind of resonate with Samantha, because I myself had some similar issues when I left the Air Force, and it can be very difficult in that you've got to negotiate and change how you interact with people, how you speak to people. Otherwise, you will find that you aren't socially accepted within this new group. So, but thankfully for George, he manages to, he's got his full pension. He managed to do his 24 years and get his pension, and he does find a home within one of the naval charities, and then of course he goes on to get married. So he has a successful transition in the end, and I'm hopeful, because transition doesn't end. That's the other thing that we really found. Transition continues throughout the life cycle beyond your service, and we're 40 years after the Falklands War this year, and so that'll be dredging up a lot of things for a lot of people, and they'll go through those transition experiences again as they negotiate. those remembered incidents and then your civilian life. So I'm going to draw to a close there. And thank you very much for listening. I hope you found that useful and informative.
Thank you very much indeed, Caroline. That was absolutely fascinating. It was really interesting to see George's experience through from that perspective. That was absolutely fascinating. Thank you very much indeed. So I'm going to ask Mark to talk next for us, if you're ready.
Oh, yes, I'm ready and willing. And Caroline, that was absolutely amazing. Thank you so much. I was really fascinated by that balanced kind of insight into life after the military, I guess, and hearing about the Falklands as well is always fascinating. Such a bizarre war, such a bizarre war. Okay, well, I'm going to talk about mostly one war, which is Afghanistan, which I had personal experience of. And I'm going to relate it a little bit to George King's life, which of course is so resonant because the feelings of post-traumatic stress disorder are there between the lines of everything you read about his life, and particularly this kind of sense of disappointment with civilian life when he leaves, or the inability to kind of feel connected to civilian life. And it's prevalent throughout the centuries, I'm afraid, after conflict. And yeah, we just don't deal with it as we should. So I'm going to try and share my screen now. Let me go to the bottom here, share screen. It says, here I am cooking on gas, everyone. Look at this. What an adult. Great. Okay, so about 2010, so that was just over 10 years ago, 11 years ago, I got an invitation from the Imperial War Museum to be interviewed for a kind of residency as a kind of war artist in Helmand, Afghanistan. So basically I would embed with 16 Air Assault Brigade, the paratroopers, over, I think it was about 3 months, all in all, something like that, and make work. And prior to that, I'd done film and photographic projects as a kind of conceptual artist with communities. Big socially engaged projects where I'd interact with a big community of people and end up usually with a photo book which documented their lives, and they would become the recipients of that book and the beneficiaries of that art project, as opposed to the art world being the beneficiary of the primary audience of the project. So I was invited to Helmand, Afghanistan. I was 45 at the time, I'm now 55. And I went for interview, and to my amazement, I was awarded this residency, and I thought, oh God, I've actually got to go now. So I immediately started trying to get myself in shape, and I think I only had like about 5 weeks between, you know, officially being accepted as this war artist to actually leaving for Brize Norton and then on to Camp Bastion in Helmand, Afghanistan. 5 weeks to prepare, in which time, you know, I had to get physically fit and also mentally prepare yourself for this idea that you're going to put yourself into danger willingly and try and make work there. So this was the kit I took with me, and as well as gas masks and all sorts of military bags and kit. There's rolls of film, there's film cameras, there's lights, there's cables, there's batteries, there's flashes, there's slow motion high-speed film cameras used in car crash testing, there's film plate cameras, there's digital cameras, there's tripods, and I was solely, uniquely responsible for getting all this kit on and off helicopters for a 3-month period, which was both physically extremely challenging and mentally very challenging as well. I'm going to whiz through these pictures quite quickly. So the most shocking thing for me was the age of people, you know, not just the local population. The Afghanis were, you know, shockingly young. The average age seemed to be about 12 or something, but also the troops, you know, you're meant to be 18 to serve on the front line, I think, in the British Army in a war zone. But I don't know, a lot of these kids look to me just that. They look like kids, not like adults. And, you know, I often go out on patrol, and I was taken all around Helmand, Afghanistan, which again, as Caroline was saying, it's an incredibly visually impactful experience being in a war zone very often. And one of the most bizarre sights was going out on patrol with a group of soldiers, and there'd be someone at the front with a metal detector, and you have to keep in line, and maybe there's 6 soldiers in front of you and 6 behind, and you can't step left or right because you might step on an IED, and it provides explosive device. And if you do that, you not only endanger your own life, you endanger the life of the person ahead of you and behind you, who are in their 20s, not an old guy like me. So, extremely high pressured and very difficult to take pictures of. And sometimes you'd be out on patrol for hours and not see anybody. And suddenly these kids would emerge totally unaccompanied, like ghosts, like apparitions. And you think, who's looking after them? Where are they going? And there'd be nothing to be seen for miles. I mean, really quite shocking stuff. And, I came to the realization that myself and a lot of the other soldiers, in fact, had been living with trauma all their lives, not just in the military, but through childhood. A lot of the people who join the army do so in a search for family, for connection, which is somehow lacking at home. I'm not saying everyone is lacking love from a family unit that joins the army or the navy, but quite a few are. And so there's a real sense of trauma, I think, amongst people in the military. And there certainly was, in my case, before I left. And ever since, trauma has been something that I've been working on. But it does seem to be particularly compounded by the military experience. And this sense of dislocation you feel when you return from the war zone. So someone I met, an officer in Afghanistan, said, he explains it like this: if you put a cat in a field and let bombs off around the cat all day, the cat might well survive, but it won't be the same animal at the end of the day. And it's the same with people, unfortunately. So if you have that kind of very frightening, disturbing, disruptive experience over a sustained period of time, which I did, I guess, and even more so the troops I was with who were looking after me, you're not the same person afterwards. And of course, things like EMDR therapy, which I strongly recommend for treating trauma, are really finding fantastic ways of treating trauma now, and it's becoming more and more accepted as a kind of therapy. Even with that, there's a limit to what therapy can do and can achieve. It's home to Afghanistan again. And again, just how young people are, just how young. So I was there for about 3 months. I came back in early 2011, and within, I think, 2 months of returning, my 10-year relationship came to an end. I was regularly getting into fights with friends for no reason whatsoever. I was behaving extremely erratically. I was having nightmares every night, for which I started drinking heavily. So I was never a heavy drinker before I went to Afghanistan. I certainly was when I came back. And I found that the only people I could really relate to were soldiers who I'd been in Afghanistan with, who stayed in touch with me. And I was living in London, and they would come to my art studio in London where I lived, and we'd hang out together, we'd be together, we'd spend time together. And all the things that are very useful in Afghanistan, for example, or in a war zone, are totally useless in a civilian environment. And all the skills that you need as a civilian, like paying bills, small talk, emails, seem totally meaningless when you return. So there's a real feeling of disconnect. And I certainly felt that reality was the war zone, and that London, my life there, this bubble that we live in Britain, was totally without any kind of meaning whatsoever. So for the first 6 months of my return, I was desperate to go back to the war zone, which of course is quite distorted thinking, because actually the healthy way to think is that the war zone is the perverted version of reality, and civilian life is the healthy version of reality. Well, I had it the other way around. I thought civilian life was somehow perverted or obscene in some way, and that the war zone was the reality that I felt most comfortable in. Anyway, so it took me about 6 months to admit that I had a problem with PTSD. And then some of my friends kindly staged a kind of intervention and said, listen, Mark, you're not yourself anymore. And I started getting treatment, and it kind of worked. But I have to say, you know, how much more difficult must it be for a soldier who's told all his life from the age of 16, man up, to admit they have a problem, go out there and find help, find psychological help, find treatment and get treatment. And that's a big ask. And so I was witness to the difficulty that soldiers find in making that jump to ask for help with trauma in a very disturbing way. And I became, you know, good friends with quite a few soldiers when I returned, who stayed in touch with me. And this guy here, Mike, became one of my best friends. He actually committed suicide just 2 years ago, and he struggled badly with trauma and would never really talk about it. And I begged him, and so did his wife, begged him to go and get therapy, to get treatment, and he never did. And I saw him slowly deteriorate from this incredibly gifted, articulate man mountain, you know, physically incredibly strong and incredibly kind, big-hearted man. I saw him self-destruct over those 9-10 years, and he died in a hotel room in Germany 2 years ago, as I say. Another person I was in contact with in Helmand has also taken his life as well. Mike actually became a professional wrestler when he came back from Helmand, and he couldn't see this connection between this real fighting he'd done in Iraq and Afghanistan and this mock theatrical fighting that he was doing underneath railway arches in this kind of latex club in London. So I wanted something good to come out of these experiences I'd had in Helmand. So I decided to make a book called Battle Against Stigma. And the idea was that I would combine my photographs of Helmand, Afghanistan with real accounts from veterans and ex-veterans and former servicemen about PTSD, and specifically accounts from people who'd say, you know, I used to think PTSD was rubbish, that it doesn't exist, but now I know it exists because either I've suffered from it or my friends have suffered from it. And so, you know, I tried to do what it says on the tin, Battle Against Stigma. And the idea was I'd make this book in an edition of about 1,500 copies, and I'd give it out to mental health charities, to prisons, to libraries, to homeless centers, all the places where, as a veteran, if you don't get treated, you can often end up, because you end up self-medicating with drink and drugs, you end up becoming violent, you lose your family, you lose your work, you lose your friends, and you basically slip through the cracks of society, and you drink so much and take so many drugs in order to blot out these memories and these traumas, that the original PTSD is so compounded, nobody knows its origins anymore. So the idea was to make this book, get it into the hands of people who needed that encouragement to come forward and get help. Anyway, so I went to the Minister of Defence and said, listen, I've got this great idea for doing a book. I'm not interested in criticising the Minister of Defence at all. The only thing I want to do is encourage more troops to come forward and seek help. And I said, you can even write a chapter in the book championing your achievements in the field of military mental health. You know, and first off, all the people in the Ministry of Defence were like Whitehall, like, yes, we love it, Mark, thank you, so great. And then within about a week, they'd rethought it and decided they really weren't ready, I don't think, to kind of fess up to what a big issue trauma and generational trauma caused by war is. And so they said, listen, we forbid you to reproduce your pictures taken in Afghanistan with these accounts from servicemen about PTSD. We forbid you to reproduce them in the same book. So I said, okay, I promise I will not reproduce them in the same book. So this is what I did. I made a book in 2 volumes, 1 slipcase. And I had this printed in Barcelona in Spain, a big company, which has since gone out of business, unfortunately, called Graphos, who make beautiful books and beautiful slipcases. Anyway, it came over to Britain from Spain in 2 consignments. The first consignment of 1,000 copies was seized by UK Border Force, who, go figure, had strong connections to the Ministry of Defence. And so I'd obviously done something to upset them. And to this day, I've never seen that consignment of 1,000 copies. And I've been talking about it on public forums, on radio and television, writing about it. And I phoned them, of course, and they have not released those books. However, a second consignment came via a different route and arrived safely in my studio. This is in 2015, 7 years ago. And then I furiously spent all summer distributing the books to those target audiences, homeless centres, prisons. I did tours of Britain throughout Britain, giving them copies of the book to mental health charities to try and connect with those veterans who'd fallen through the cracks. And then I also reproduced my own story about my own journey with PTSD in The Independent on Sunday, which was then a newspaper, not just an online presence. And as soon as that went online, and I put my email address at the end of the article saying, if you or your brother or your mother have experienced some kind of war trauma, get in touch with me at this email address and I will send you free of charge a copy of my book. And as soon as that went online in May 2015, I got an email every 10 minutes for about 3 months, every 10 minutes from a veteran or the relation of a veteran saying, I recognize a version of myself in you, in your story, and I want a copy of the book. And not only saying, give me a copy of the book, but going into incredible personal detail about what happened to them, either emotionally and that impossibility of a seamless adjustment from the war zone to civilian life, or going into incredible detail about people they'd killed in war zones and how they never managed to get rid of that guilt and shame that they felt. This is an example of one of the first emails I got. Obviously, I've changed the name of the sender. So out of the blue, that led me to my current project and my current location, which is Eastern Ukraine, Donbass. I'm about 2 kilometers from the front line here, where about 100,000 Russian troops are amassed. And out of the blue, I got an email from Kiev Military Hospital saying, we heard about your book. Do you have a version of your PTSD book in Ukrainian language? And I was so touched that this post-Soviet country would be so forward-thinking about treating their veterans, their traumatized veterans, when my own country had tried to effectively ban the book, that I got the book translated into Ukrainian as a PDF, sent it out there. And I thought, no, I want to go and visit Kiev, Ukraine. And I went there, I visited the military hospital in Kiev, and I just fell in love with this country. But I guess what really strikes me about George King's story is this impossibility of a seamless adjustment after a sustained war experience. And I really see trauma as something being generational now as well, in that it's proven now that when you're deeply traumatized by something like war, then your DNA gets coated with a chemical which gets passed on to your kids and then onto their kids. So war isn't just damaging in the short term in that it kills and maims and harms people. It crashes whole generations of people. And I think, you know, in some ways we've come to understand this more and we're talking about it more, but there needs to be much more support for veterans, and much more. And we need to talk about conflict more, and we need to understand it more. And we need to look at stories like George's to understand how little we've advanced since George King's time, how little we've progressed, how little we've managed to care for veterans and people who serve in war zones, and how badly we treat people when they come back from conflict areas. So I think I'd like to stop talking there. Is that okay? Is that presentation okay for you?
Absolutely wonderful, Mark. Thank you very much indeed. Really appreciate you sharing such a, you know, that kind of a really direct personal experience. It's, you know, really important, I think, for people to hear. So thank you very much indeed for that.
Thank you. Thank you. do I have to unshare my, stop sharing my screen, don't I? Sorry about that. Sorry, Chris.
I'm sure that we'll end up with quite a lot of questions for you. That's all right. Thank you. Now, would you like to take it away, Chris? Don't forget to unmute yourself.
There we go. I've hit the right button. I hope you can hear me. I can see you nodding.
Perfect.
Kathleen, super. Okay, well, thanks so much. It's great to be here and to kind of see you all. As I've said earlier, I'm approaching this as a historian of medicine and particularly psychiatry. And while I mostly research and teach on the late 19th and 20th century, I find George King's account, his extraordinary diary that we have, I find that a fascinating jumping off point for thinking about the relationship between war and mental health in an earlier period in the late 18th and in the late 18th and the early 19th centuries. As Caroline has already flagged up for us, there are a lot of really striking parallels between the present day and George King's life and experiences. And I think, Mark, you've also kind of developed this idea that, there's kind of more we have more continuities than we might realize between the 18th and 19th centuries. For me, what's really interesting is what's different, actually, especially when it comes to how George and his contemporaries appeared to think about mental health in the wake of violence. And so that's what I'm going to be speaking about now. So the diagnostic category that we use today to think about this relationship, and that Mark, you've already talked about, post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD, this was only added to the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the so-called Bible of the American Psychiatric Association in 1980. It's a relatively new category, one usually linked to the experiences of American veterans returning from the Vietnam War and to the experiences of Holocaust survivors too, though it built on and developed earlier understandings of trauma, including, of course, cases of shell shock from the First World War. But at the time when George King was serving in the Royal Navy in the early 19th century, not only was this diagnosis of PTSD not available to physicians, but even how people understood trauma was radically different to how we understand and use that term today. At the time when George King lived and wrote, if people spoke of trauma, what they meant was physical trauma, physical injury, the kind of trauma that you might still hear today in the context of blunt force trauma, for instance. Trauma didn't start to acquire the psychological meaning which we associate with it today until the end of the 19th century, when a German psychiatrist came up with a new term to describe the mental suffering of the survivors of often horrific railway accidents. And the term he came up with was traumatic neurosis. And I should say at this point that there's nothing specific to the history of trauma in this story of gradual emergence and relabeling, change over time. It's not unique. Diagnostic categories rarely remain fixed or unchanging in the history of psychiatry. And here we might think about psychiatric diagnoses which have disappeared over time, like homosexuality, removed from the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual in 1973, or other psychiatric diagnoses which have only become widely used in recent decades, like attention deficit hyperactivity disorder or ADHD. So there's nothing specific to the history of trauma that this category has changed over time, has acquired new meanings, has taken on new labels. Given, however, that trauma only acquired this psychological meaning in the late 19th century, how might George King and his contemporaries have thought about what we would today call PTSD without that term available to them? How do they think about the emotional and psychological impact of war, of conflict, of violence? Did they see these things as being related at all? It's pretty clear, and I think I completely agree with Caroline and Mark on this, that even in the absence of a specific diagnostic category like PTSD or trauma, it's pretty clear that people throughout history have experienced emotional and psychological distress as a result of violent, terrible, unexpected events. And we can see that even in the century before George King was born. The accounts of observers and participants in the English Civil War offer evidence that they saw the brutal and extreme events of that conflict as leaving marks on the mind, distressing it, scarring it, leaving changed characters and outlooks in war's wake. But how that damage was described and expressed and perhaps even experienced looks really different to what we might be familiar with today. And I think George King's diary helps us begin to understand that, helps us begin to get a sense of this. So during his many long years of service in the Royal Navy, George obviously took part in a number of battles at sea, including most famously the Battle of Trafalgar in October 1805. He writes about these battles sometimes in great detail, but his diary does not, as Caroline's already said, contain much by way of reflection on the impact of these events with their sustained stresses, their brutality, their losses on his mental or emotional state. Reading his diary today, you're really left with no sense of what he felt during or after these sometimes horrifically violent events. I just wanted to give you a quite graphic example of this. Not George's description of Trafalgar, but rather a later battle, one which took place in the summer of 1809 when he was serving on the frigate Melpomene in the Baltic during the Anglo-Russian War. So with the Melpomene in serious trouble, and you can see kind of a later depiction of that on screen, with it in serious trouble, surrounded by Danish gunboats and at risk of destruction, George and many others were sent out in smaller cutters, smaller ships to board the enemy gunboats. While they were ultimately successful and the Melpomene survived the encounter, lived to fight another day, the casualties George witnessed that day were horrifying. 5 of the 7 men on his side of the boat were killed by enemy guns just 10 yards away. 5 others on that same boat were killed as well, including the captain's coxswain. And I quote here from George's own diary, when he writes, "The captain's coxswain was close alongside of me. His head was blown clean off his shoulder. Part of his head took my hat and his brain flew all over me." So a really graphic description of horrendous violence and loss happening right before his eyes. Such are the scale of losses on George's cutter that the boat is rendered almost useless for combat purposes for the rest of the battle. Instead, the cutter takes on the grim but necessary job of gathering the dead and the wounded, as many George recalls as they could stow on the ship. One man they take on board has suffered horrendous injuries. He's had both of his legs blown off close to the knee. And he was in such misery, George writes, that he had got his knife out of his pocket and opened it and was going to cut his belly right athwart, but we took the knife from him. The man goes on to beg that they heave him overboard. Before the surgeons coming out of the nearby harbour were able to reach the man and provide aid, he had drawn his last breath and sadly died, George tells us. And when this battle is over, the captain orders George and the other men on his cutter to go and rest, giving them each rum, bread and cheese. And after drinking, George goes and lies down in his berth, and he's soon fast asleep, he tells us, sleeping through undisturbed until the following morning. George's account is a harrowing one. It's a really graphic one, but reading it, you are struck by how little reflection there is on the impact all that he had witnessed and experienced had on him at a personal level, either in kind of his telling of this at the time, or even kind of his later, reflecting back on this at a later point in the diary. It's really difficult to kind of get any sense of how these events affected him. We might well read meaning into his alcohol use here. So he seems to turn to drinking after close encounters like this battle, but also at a near sinking in 1808. There seems to be a connection here, and as the Foundling Museum's wonderful exhibition on George King suggests, George may well have been drinking in response to combat stress and trauma, and we can kind of see that pattern of drinking after stressful events or after kind of life-threatening events throughout the diary. It's certainly a plausible reading of his alcohol use as a response to the horrors of war, but it's also really difficult to see where the line might be between alcohol use resulting from the emotional and psychological strains of war and alcohol use, which was often regarded as a disciplinary matter, certainly, but otherwise normal, socially acceptable, and even encouraged at the time. And then it's worth saying here that it's clear from his diary that at least on some of the ships, many of the ships that he serves on, as Caroline said, George really does build up a sense of camaraderie. He really does settle in, he builds up friendships, he enjoys the company of his fellow seamen. He is drinking socially. So it is really difficult to speculate too much on his alcohol use from what we have. George's stoic, matter-of-fact way of writing might strike us as unusually detached today, but it was fairly typical of the time. And in not dwelling on any emotional or psychological reaction to the violence he witnessed and the fighting he took part in, he was also fairly typical. Seamen did suffer mental breakdowns in this period. Indeed, as the historian Catherine Beck calculates, a much higher rate of mental illness was reported among men in naval service than in the general population in the early 19th century, so that many more proportionally ended up being confined for treatment in asylums like London's Bethlem Hospital in this period. But this was not attributed to the strains and pressures of war and violence. It was often seen instead as being a result of head injuries, brought about by drunkenness in the cramped, confined and dangerous space of the ship, or it was related to sunstroke and the impact of the different climates through which sailors were likely to move during their time at sea. Climate in particular was seen as a really important cause of mental illness in this period, and it was central to how George King and his contemporaries thought about, for instance, growing rates of mental illness among Europeans in India, which was at that time increasingly coming under colonial rule and becoming home to ever more British soldiers, administrators, and missionaries. So it isn't simply that trauma or PTSD as a label, they aren't available to George King and his contemporaries to apply to and make sense of their experiences. There was a really quite different way of thinking about the causes of mental illness, which placed much more stress on climate, for instance, than experiences of violence. But the unavailability of this diagnosis mattered. It did make a difference that trauma as a label couldn't be applied to sailors' experiences in this period, that physicians couldn't certify them with a recognized psychiatric diagnosis. When traumatic neurosis was first coined in the late 19th century, it was in no small part because it allowed those who had suffered emotional and psychological damage in accidents involving railways or factory machinery to lay claim to insurance, compensation, and pensions. Later on, PTSD emerged in part to acknowledge the experiences of Vietnam War veterans and guarantee them a disability pension. It did something similar for Holocaust survivors who sought compensation from the West German government around the same time as well. And later still, it would offer women who had suffered domestic and sexual abuse, especially childhood sexual abuse, a kind of legal defense in cases where they appeared to snap and murder their abusers. Now, none of this is to say, this is not at all to say that the diagnosis was invented for the purposes of making money through insurance claims or to escape legal culpability, though that was certainly how some across the 20th century saw it. They were really concerned about fraud. And as Mark has spoken about, even today, governments may not always be willing to face up to this diagnosis. But it is to say that in response to the emotional and psychological suffering that had clearly been experienced by people who had gone through often inexpressible horrors, psychiatrists, legal experts, and activists pushed for and helped drive the establishment of a new diagnostic term, which would recognize this and acknowledge these people's suffering, and perhaps more importantly, provide them with a way to get support or protection. That at least is the kind of theory of it. In George King's day, mental illness brought about during service did not entitle veterans to a pension. After many long decades of naval service, when George King finally decided that he had had enough and came ashore for good, he was admitted as a pensioner to the Greenwich Royal Hospital, the naval equivalent of the Chelsea Royal Hospital, whose pensioners we are perhaps more familiar with today. But he was not admitted as a pensioner on the basis of any particular injury or disability, though he had certainly had more than his fair share of illness, dysentery and typhus among them, and his body would have taken a beating from the extraordinary physical demands placed on it by life at sea. This was not sufficient to guarantee him a place, however. And in fact, the first time he applies in December 1834, there were 300 men applying for just 13 places, and on that occasion, he wasn't one of the lucky 13 chosen. It was more luck than anything else that meant the next time he applied, he was one of the 9 chosen to enter the hospital and be provided with the standard issue blue jacket with gold buttons and breeches that the Greenwich pensioners wore. Even at the Chelsea Royal Hospital, where pensions were for a short time in the early decades of the 19th century more directly linked to things like length of service, age and disability, it was only physical injuries and conditions which were taken into account. Psychological damage was not recognised or given special consideration in the system for determining pensions. So George and his contemporaries did not see the kind of clear link between exceptional events of extreme violence and brutality and mental ill health that we do today, and that we talk about using the term trauma. As I've said, even that word itself has a very different meaning in this period. There were other ways of thinking about mental illness among seamen like George, ways linked to how medical experts and lay people alike thought about the importance of climate, for instance. But just as important perhaps to remember is that no official form of support would have been offered to those who did argue that there was a link between their mental distress and their experiences of violence. It wouldn't have guaranteed them compensation or a pension, or even provided them with the recognition and acknowledgement and access to treatment that a diagnosis of PTSD might do today. George King may well have been profoundly psychologically affected by the extreme as well as everyday violence he would have experienced during his many decades at sea. But he may well also have concluded with some justification that there was nothing to be gained by writing about this, reflecting on this, reliving this. in the absence of any of these mechanisms of support or recognition. So I think George King's account gives us a window into how he and his contemporaries might have thought about naval service, traveling the sea, war, and mental ill health. But just as importantly, perhaps, I think it provides us with a mirror that we might hold up and use to reflect on the difference that a diagnostic category like PTSD might make today. I'm going to leave it there, and I'll hit the stop share button. Thanks everyone for listening.
Thank you very much indeed, Chris. Well, that was absolutely fascinating from all of our panelists. I can't thank you all enough. That's been a really interesting set of presentations so far. I'm conscious that I might be slightly fading in and out. I think I might be having some issues with my Wi-Fi temporarily.
It was more the so far that I was laughing at.
Yeah. More presentations to come. Yeah, we're going to all go again. Yeah. We'll try and do better this time, Kathleen.
No, that's been absolutely terrific. Thank you so much, all of you. So I'm going to just invite our audience to, if they have any questions that they'd like to ask our panelists, to pop them into the Q&A or the chat. I'll keep an eye on both of them, but I'm going to start the ball rolling. I've got lots of questions. So I'm going to start with Caroline and ask her, I think in some of the conversations we've had, you've talked a little bit about what's actually available for veterans today and how it's moved on maybe a tiny bit from when Mark was in Afghanistan. And perhaps there's a little bit more kind of provision starting to be put in place.
Yes, thanks for that, Kathleen. I think there is. I think there's still a long way to go, but I think there's definitely changes afoot. So the Ministry of Defence has what's called Joint Service Publication now, which is trying to provide a holistic policy with regards how people transition out of the military into civilian street. And within that, you can, if you're still serving or if you've actually left the military, there is avenues you can go through to get referred in order to seek help and get extra support. That support comes from within the military and from without the military. But that JSP was only published in 2018, and I don't know that it's widely known about. I certainly didn't know about it till very recently. And I think last year the NHS has again tried to almost corral that there are so many military charities out there, literally hundreds of them, and it can be really difficult for people to know where to go for help. Mm-hmm. And so the forces, charities themselves are trying to come together in order to provide a more united front, if you like, to help people that need help. And the NHS is, if you Google Up Courage online, that will take you to the NHS website, which will help veterans who need help because they're suffering from PTSD or any other trauma. So there is stuff out there now, but it's still very much, there's still obviously more that can be done, more needs to be done to help veterans. And I think one of the things that Mark mentioned was this idea of asking for help, you know, military masculinities, you know, that is a really profound thing for all genders within the military organisation, you know, that inability to show or admit weakness. Because if you're still serving, that could affect your promotion possibilities. And, you know, your whole identity is geared around being a competent, capable person who can take on the world and keep going. And then to have that questioned, or to question that to yourself and then to admit it to other people is very, very difficult.
Yeah.
So that ties in with a question we've got in from Helen, actually. which say, what reflections do you all have on the question of how shame might prevent people from being heard who are veterans, how it might stop them telling their stories? She says she means society shame at what war does to people and why veterans seem to be ignored and pressurized not to speak out when they get home. So maybe from Vietnam right the way through to sort of Iraq and Afghanistan. Mark, do you want to say something about that?
Well, it's psychologically proven that, you know, quite often people want to express a trauma, and it doesn't necessarily have to be about war. It could be any kind of trauma. You know, some of the people who got in touch with me were ambulance drivers, or, you know, policemen, or people in civilian jobs, you know. But something stops you processing that trauma. And not just on a kind of biological level, but also on something gets in the way, and that thing is quite often shame. It is shame, you know, because it's so deeply painful to come to terms with having killed someone. You know, I remember one of the emails I got was from someone who used to fly a tornado. And he described something called death TV. So he had this little black and white monitor in his plane, which was nine inches across. And he said when they dropped a bomb, you just see this little pixelated figure disintegrate, and that was someone effectively being blown up. And he said when he was flying his missions, he used to watch death television, as they called it, and see people disintegrate on television, and not think anything about it, and go to bed, get up the next day and do the same thing again. But as soon as he left the military and got home, every night he just had nightmares, death television playing over and over and over and over again. Now, coming to terms with that kind of trauma, that kind of shame, that kind of guilt is unfathomable for most people, you know. It's such a massive pressure. Such a huge amount of guilt to process. So on top of the trauma, you've got this other thing called shame or guilt coming in saying, don't process it, because it's, you know, you deserve to live with that pain. You know, you're a bad man, you're a bad woman, you know, you deserve to live with this trauma. So, you know, I think that's hitting it on the head, is that sense of shame and guilt. I don't know what other people think about that.
I think what's really interesting, kind of, Mark, listening to you speak, and also kind of thinking about Helen's question about shame and trauma. In some ways, you know, PTSD emerges in the aftermath of the Vietnam War as a way of sidestepping shame, because this is, you know, obviously a deeply unpopular war at home. It's one very controversial, and PTSD as a category kind of emerges as a way of trying to kind of take the politics out of it and say, this is, you know, we don't have to kind of, we can separate out kind of the actions of the government or kind of the actions of the kind of military command from the kind of suffering that has been experienced by service personnel in Vietnam. And so in some ways it's kind of a way of not so much, this isn't so much kind of about shame when it's how it's experienced or how it's felt by kind of veterans themselves, more about kind of how PTSD emerges in this context of national shame about a war, and becomes a way of managing that, or kind of sidestepping or kind of quarantining it. So I think it's a really interesting question. And I think thinking even further back, what's really striking about kind of George King's time, although I'm conscious that I'm speaking to an actual expert on the period here, is that there doesn't seem to be as much of an association with shame, because actually mental illness in this context, the kind of mental illness that seamen are presumed to be liable to, head injuries, climate, kind of moving through these different climates, experiencing sunstroke and stuff, that isn't something that they have any kind of control over. It's also seen as something that's temporary. So when they are sent to Bethlehem, for instance, for treatment, that isn't something that's seen as shameful. And actually there's a kind of question mark over how far that even, you know, affects their hopes for promotion or advancement, or kind of, you know, rejoining service after being discharged. Caroline, something that you were kind of talking about. So I think that kind of question of shame and trauma is really interesting historically as well as obviously Mark, what you've been talking about in terms of contemporary questions around that.
I think I wonder if there's something about the kind of stigma of mental illness more generally that stops people from coming forward, because I think there is kind of still for a lot of people a stigma around any kind of mental illness, and I think that may be something socially that makes it a little bit that plays into that kind of difficulty in coming forward. No, thank you all very much. That was very, very interesting to hear your kind of thoughts on that, because I think there are lots. I think it's quite a complex issue around shame and whose shame and how exactly that operates to kind of either prevent people coming forward or prevent us as a country perhaps dealing with it more effectively. So I think it's kind of twofold. I wonder if you have.
I was going to say, I think a lot of people who join the military come from, do come from disadvantaged homes where there isn't a great deal of care. I have to say that. And I'm sorry if I'm offending anyone, because I'm from a similarly uncaring background, I feel. And I think that actually people come into the military with feelings about shame, about not being able to look after themselves properly, on a basic level, and the army acts as a kind of family in some respects, and those feelings of shame are played upon and perpetuated through the military experience for some people, I would say. I know Caroline might find that a deeply contentious thing to say. Do you agree with that?
I don't, I'm afraid. I mean, the minute you're socialized within the military environment, for it to become your family. And at the end of the day, killing is not natural for us morally and ethically. It's not something that that's acceptable. And in order to train people to kill, you've got to create that bond within your group of people, and you've got to other the enemy. You've got to make the enemy the other, so dehumanize them. And we saw that in World War II with the propaganda about the Japanese and the Germans, and almost subhuman, effectively, in order to give you the moral legitimacy, if you like, to kill the enemy. So no, I don't disagree with you, Mark. I think the military institution is very clever. I'm a critical military scholar, really, in terms of how I look at the military. And I know, having lived through my own service and beyond, I can see how, in many ways, there's a manipulation going on. And for me, that's one of the reasons why a just war is so important. The theory of a just war. And what we're left with Iraq and Afghanistan is a big question mark over both those conflicts, which I think is going to play out when we talk about shame. Where's that going to take us in the coming years as veterans start to leave the military and start thinking about their place and their responsibility within those conflicts?
Absolutely, yeah. Jesus, it's so scary, isn't it? So scary.
But I do know, and I don't like to give credit where credit's due, but I do know the Ministry of Defence and the Office for Veteran Affairs are taking these issues really seriously, and they are producing research and asking for scholars to look into how we can better help our veterans. And I know as well that a lot of senior service people, men and women, took to social media as Afghanistan fell last summer to try and speak to the military community and the military community's families of military personnel, to say that it wasn't all in vain, and talk about their own PTSD experiences. So shame it's definitely still there, but I think it's definitely more still, it is being talked about in a different way, perhaps. And I'm astounded at your 1,000 missing books, Mark. I feel like we should have a campaign to get your 1,000 missing
Well,
books
I'm
back
trying
out
to
there.
trying to shame the government, you know. I'm trying to flip it around and put the shame on them, you see.
Yes, I'm absolutely.
I'm self-actualizing the shame and like Harry Potter putting it onto the government. So I have a clear conscience. It's okay.
My apologies, I lost connection for a little while, so I see that you all carried on beautifully without me, which is I'm very, very grateful. I have a question for all of you, which is, do you think we can actually form a useful opinion from George's memoir of whether he may have suffered from PTSD? I mean, we touched on that a little bit, but I don't know what your personal response is really, whether you think there's sort of any evidence to go on, or whether he's so deadpan about his emotional life that it's not really possible to say.
To say what, Caroline? Sorry, to say what, Kathleen?
Just to come to any conclusion about whether you think that George himself suffered from trauma. I mean, whether it's there kind of between the lines, or whether, you know, we just can't really make a judgment from here.
I think there's absolutely, sorry, go on, Chris.
No, you go ahead, Mark.
Well, personally, I think there's absolutely no question he's traumatized. But what do you think, Chris?
Well, I was going to say that as historians, I think we're often really reluctant to kind of diagnose retrospectively, or kind of. But I think actually, you know, one of the things that strikes me, and Helen's put this in the chat as well, actually, kind of the graphic. You know, it's so striking that and it was kind of why I've spent so long kind of reading it out, like the description that he gives and the detail and like graphic kind of, this is what happened and these were the people, and actually, you know, he isn't kind of overtly emotional in this text. He isn't kind of saying, I felt, you know, he doesn't kind of reflect on this and kind of what it means. And I think that is because I don't think there's any point necessarily for him doing that. Like, this is a harrowing thing to relive. If you're not going to get access to support, or kind of, if it's not going to do, why would you, you know, put yourself back through that? And I think that's why PTSD makes it why that kind of, having that spoken about, having that kind of word there, having that kind of a diagnosis available, that's really important. But I think the kind of description itself, the kind of detail, may also be part of his way of processing this, right? Like, and this is something that medical anthropologists talk about today when they're thinking about kind of how, you know, ways of expressing oneself that may not seem emotive or kind of emotional or kind of, you know, particularly kind of introspective on the surface, but actually are lists of items lost, kind of properties lost, and people killed, you know, like listing kind of in a really, what we would see as maybe matter of fact, quite, you know, cold way. If we think about kind of our emotional investment in, for instance, objects that kind of are destroyed, if we think about kind of what's happening in him constructing that list and taking the pen to write it out, and kind of then, you know, to note it down initially, but then also to work it into his diary, you know, I think actually he may not seem like he's emotional or kind of psychologically reflecting on this, but actually maybe that act of writing out these details, listing this, keeping this kind of detailed record, maybe that is actually kind of his way of processing what he's been through.
I'd have to agree. I found a lot of our veterans, when they're talking about their trauma and their PTSD, it's very compartmentalized in how they discuss it. But I know from my own writings, when I'm talking about some of the things that I dealt with when I was in the military, you relive it every time you read it, and it's exhausting and it's tiring. So I don't blame him for being quite, you know,
matter of fact in the way that he describes it. Yeah.
Every time you read it, every time you go through it, it's more emotionally draining, and you know, it wears you out and ties you down.
That's really interesting, because we think that George probably wrote this memoir at the point where he was in the Greenwich Hospital. So when he had, you know, a safe place to be and meals and was being kind of cared for in that institutional settings. So he had the time and space to be able to reflect back. But you know, talking with Helen as the creator of the show, our feeling was that he probably was keeping some kind of a commonplace book or notebook of what was going on, because he's so precise about some of the details. And so you do have that sense he was probably writing on a fairly regular basis, but this is his kind of polished account. And he's, you know, you have to ask who the audience is for it, I think.
Yeah.
As well, it's not quite clear who he's writing it for. But suddenly, as a veteran of Trafalgar, at the time when he's writing, that becomes a kind of status thing that he was there. So maybe it's to do with that he starts to feel that his story is worth telling.
I also think, just kind of, Kathleen, picking up your point about him keeping this probably kind of a running kind of list of, you know, kind of notes as he was going along, right? Because absolutely, I don't know. Well, maybe he just had a much better memory than I did. But there's no way kind of the details that he's put in that. But you know, one of the things he talks about, kind of the aftermath of that battle that I talked about from the Melpomene, and you know what he does, and he drinks and eats and goes to sleep. But at some point, he must have sat down and written out that, you know, 5 of the people beside him were killed, and you know 5 other people were killed, and this happened to him. Like at some point, he has to be sitting down and kind of, whether it's that night, whether it's the next day, whether it's sometime that month, you know, he has to be. And he doesn't tell us he does that, obviously, but you know that has to have been kind of a profoundly challenging kind of experience for him. And we don't know kind of how he's, you know, what actually he strips out in the kind of move from those notes to the kind of the finished diary. But yeah, I think I'm just really struck by that image as you were speaking of kind of him sitting down to write this out in note form well before the diary itself gets written.
Because I think one of the other things that's come out in all of the I'm going to actually ask Helen's question that's just popped up because it looks really interesting. So Helen asks if Caroline and Mark think that historical documents like George's autobiography can be helpful or even therapeutic just by opening up conversations like this with veterans. So, you know, these kind of historical accounts, do they have a value in, you know, just opening up a conversation with people about their own experience?
Absolutely, that's what culture does, that's what history does, that's what art does. It creates a kind of space which is in some ways very loaded, but in other ways very neutral, and allows people to feel that they can share their own experiences and kind of see a version of themselves through other portrayals, you know, and that's what allows other people, I think, to come forward and say, oh, that happened to me, you know, I felt like that. And that's really important, you know, especially when you're dealing with trauma and trying to overcome shame and feel connected to other people going through the same thing. So it can really be a way of bringing people together, veterans together. And of course, I think it's really, really valuable. What do you think, Caroline and Chris?
Absolutely. I mean, I was constantly struck when I read his memoir about the patterns and associations that are still happening in people's transitions out of the military today, and the very matter-of-factual way they talk about the violence and the trauma through to, I mean, you could when he lost his Rivington was his friend, wasn't it, who was, you know, you could feel that loss when he spoke about him. And
so that was his best friend from the hospital as a child. Yeah.
And I think it's as Mark said, it's really important for people to realise that this is not something they're going through alone, that it's something that other people have experienced and felt and got through the other side. And again, in the Military Afterlives project I'm working on, it's interesting, Mark was talking about generational trauma, and he was talking about it more from the scientific space, but to slightly change it in terms of generation, we see a lot of military service going through families. So the father and the son, or the mothers and the daughters and uncles and aunts and brothers and sisters, and we can see that there's one example that comes up in our research where the father didn't realise he had PTSD till his son started exhibiting signs of it himself, and he realised all of a sudden that his moods and his feelings were actually, you could see it in his son, and it was just really moving and fascinating. And luckily they both were able to deal with this, not through alcohol but through physical fitness and physical activity, and that's how they channeled their PTSD to deal with it. So it is, yeah, it is absolutely important.
The only thing I would add to that is that this is something that is being done kind of by this amazing charity called Restoration Trust, which uses, not for kind of veterans specifically and not with PTSD specifically, but with people living with mental health issues and difficulties, looking at the archives of mental hospitals in the past and kind of trying to see themselves in these historical kind of case files and archives, and exactly what you were saying, Caroline, about kind of being able to see that they are not the first person in history to have kind of experienced this, that they're not kind of out there alone, and you know that there are kind of happy outcomes, and kind of that can be a real kind of, you know, that project is amazing, kind of as you know, and that is using kind of mental health archives more generally, but seems like it would be something to kind of think about with this particular autobiography.
It's showing that it's not a weakness, that it's normal to feel these things and to have these concerns and these doubts.
So I'm going to ask both of you to send me those links that you've mentioned, and I'll pop them out in an email to the people who've booked this evening so that they can follow up. Because I think you mentioned Up Courage as well, Caroline, and it'd be good to just let people know a little bit more about that. Fantastic. The other thing that's really stood out to me is this conversation about sort of community and family, because that's come up, I think, in the way that all of you have talked about it, and the way that that moment of kind of the way that George went from one community in the hospital and then into his community in the Navy and then into his community at the Greenwich Hospital. That seems to be really important to him in sort of for his well-being. And I don't know, but I just have a sense that that's something that's kind of really difficult in transitioning out of the forces, and that the retaining that community is really important. And Mark, you mentioned the people that you kept in touch with when you got back from Afghanistan and how important that was for you. And I just didn't know if you had anything that you'd like to add about that.
I mean, I would like to say about, yeah, family. You know, a lot of people go into the military at a very young age and they can't even, you know, brush their own teeth, and basic stuff. It's true. It's true. It's very, very sad thing to say, but it's true. And then you see the level of, you know, the kind of level of abandonment that a lot of people experience at a very young age. So of course, you know, the army is a very welcoming environment when you've come from that kind of abandonment, and you know, it's a very easy position in which the army can manipulate young people and mold them, and those feelings of shame that you have at a very young age are never really processed. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that yes, you have war trauma. But I mean, you know, George probably experienced a great deal of trauma even before he went, you know, into the Navy. So, you know, you have trauma upon trauma, and I don't know what I'm trying to say with that, but yeah, it's something to do with family, and yeah, I think I talked to all of you before we started this discussion last week. And I talked about the experience I had on the front line in Ukraine in November. And I stayed overnight with some of the soldiers, 128th Brigade in Mariupol, and their commander had recently been killed. And I was staying in a basement, unventilated space with about 20 guys, quite a small room, terrible makeshift beds. You know, the smell was awful, but more than the smell, the sense of shame was palpable in the room, the sense of abandonment, the sense of fear. And I had the most terrible nightmares of my life. And I hadn't really connected with PTSD for 10 years. And suddenly it all came flooding back. And it was something about the feeling of shame and abandonment in that room. And it wasn't just about the war. it was about abandonment by family somehow. I can't say it in, you know, more explicit terms than that, but it was something like that, a feeling, you know. Yeah, really powerful, really powerful. And I somehow feel that, you know, fears of abandonment that we all have as children are somehow connected to, you know, war trauma. I don't know how, but I feel that they are. I've probably talked too much about
I think that's one
I've
of the things that
haven't I? I don't know.
that's all right. I think that's one of the things that we haven't sort of delved into in a lot of depth about George's life this evening, but you know, he obviously has that history as a looked after child that he takes with him. So he would have been fostered by a foster mother until he was about 5, and then separated from her permanently at that age before going to be educated. And then he would have left that community of the Foundling Hospital, gone out into his apprenticeship, and must have felt quite alone. You know, and then before finding that kind of maybe a new sense of community in the Navy. So, you know, he's obviously bringing that past with him, as we all do. You know, we take our childhood with us into our adult lives. It's still inside us.
One of the things I didn't pick out, just because of time really, but George talks about meeting a couple of fellow sailors when he's on the way back to London who were also being invalided out of the military, and they were quite ill, and he bonded with them almost straight away, ended up spent the night with them, shared lodgings, shared transport with them onwards, and we see that a lot, and I feel that a lot as well, as and maybe Mark's experienced it. You know, when you are with another military person, you may never have met them before, but you have a connection in a way that you don't with some of with civilians you can meet when you're out and about. And your military friendships. I mean, my military friends are spread to 4 corners of the country, if not the world, and it doesn't matter that I don't see them for 5 years. You know, you can really fall back into those relationships very quickly and very easily, because you've got those shared experiences to go back on. So that the sense of family. Sorry, Mark.
No, go on. Sorry, Caroline.
Just that the sense of family is very strong within. You know, they'll talk about, veterans will talk about their military brothers and their military sisters now in a way that they wouldn't have done even 20 years ago. And that's reaching out. I see a lot of veterans organisations and veterans helping veterans on my LinkedIn profile, you know, and sharing and trying to help each other. So yeah, sorry.
I was going to say I have to leave the conversation. It's 10 o'clock here, and I have to be up at 5, and then we're going to the trenches, to the front line. It sounds dramatic, I know, but it's just
that's absolutely fine. We're just about to wrap up anyway, Mark.
I'm going to be a basket case.
Yeah.
And yeah, you know, I've got
thank
to
you very much.
kill
really
Russians with one hand and photograph them with the other. It's going to be a difficult day tomorrow.
Yeah. So
Stay
really
safe,
appreciate
Mark.
you joining us, and when it would have been so late for you. Thanks ever so much, Mark.
Thank you. Thanks so much, everyone.
I think that's our trigger to wrap things up. But thank you very much indeed to the panel. That's been a really fascinating evening. I think, you know, we've really kind of explored that particular aspect of George's life in lots of interesting detail. I feel like I've learned a tremendous amount, so I'm really grateful. And thank you very much to our audience for being so patient and asking so many interesting questions.
Thank you very much, Kathleen.
Yeah.
Thanks so much, Kathleen, for organising. Thanks everyone for coming.
Yeah.
Take care, everyone. Bye.
Okay, have a good evening. Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.